Donkey Kong Country 2: Diddy's Kong Quest is one of the greatest platformers ever made. It's the sixth best-selling game released for the Super Nintendo, and it's widely regarded as being better than the original Donkey Kong Country in a lot of ways today. If you look online, there's a ton of nostalgia for this little monkey platformer, and its classic status is despite the fact that it does a lot of weird stuff that would never happen in a modern game today. Like, I don't know, Donkey Kong not being playable in a Donkey Kong Country game, or honestly like half of the level themes in this game. Those quirks just make people like the game more, and Diddy's Kong Quest's level design is one of the most studied of all time. There's one concept I don't really see talked about much in all that discussion, however. It's a topic that is the cornerstone of the entire platformer genre that Donkey Kong Country 2 absolutely masters, and it's a huge part about what makes it stand out as a great game, and that is tension. It might not seem like much, but DKC2 masters tension as a concept in its design and atmosphere in a way I barely see talked about. There's a palpable sense of suspense within the entire game in a way that's very unique, even when other platformers make use of the concept. In fact, you can't really have a good platformer at all without it. Without tension, a platformer is an absolutely pitiful experience. Even some pretty easy platformer games like Kirby have tension in them. Don't worry, I'll define specifically what I mean by that in a minute, of course, and how it relates to platformer games. Anytime I see tension or suspense discussed in the context of game design, it's always been for horror games. And yeah, that's great. I'm glad we're able to have such discussions, but tension is so much more than just horror. It's an essential step to any narrative, and any video game. The sense of tension in DKC2 is achieved in a lot of different ways, and contributes to the legend that is Diddy's Kong Quest. Let's talk about it. Tension is a concept that's difficult to define fully, but when we're talking about narrative tension, people broadly mean the act of using suspense to generate anxiety in the audience about what will happen to the characters next. It's a feeling of being unsure about if the heroes can win, or if the outcome of the story will be what's expected or not. Really, it's the base of all stories, because without tension there is no conflict, and tension is what keeps us invested in a story. Tension is not literally about knowledge, because if so, nobody would want to rewatch shows they like when they know the outcome. It's more of a feeling within the narrative, and an atmosphere that keeps a story going. It's definitely still about knowledge in a way though. I mean, if we didn't know the stakes of a story, there couldn't be any tension, and critical knowledge being withheld is a fundamental part of narrative tension as well. If you show a bomb dropping on a city block and Superman flying to stop it, you got a tense situation. If you show a bunch of civilians underneath the path of the bomb, the stakes are raised through the audience and the character's knowledge of the situation. If you show a bunch of orphans and puppies in the path of the bomb, the audience will groan and say, oh come on, they never show them dying. Which shows that narrative tension is a balancing act, and that you have to make the stakes and the tension believable. Don't worry though, I'll give a more concrete example of narrative tension and connect it with the subject of this video, the Funny Monkey sequel, and that is with the movie that I think has one of my personal favorite suspenseful scenes I've ever seen. That is Die Hard 2. Yes, really. Die Hard 2 is a fairly simple story about a cop who has to stop a group of terrorists who have taken over an airport on Christmas Eve, working with a military who wants nothing to do with him, as the lives of everyone whose planes are inbound to that airport are on the line. Midway through the film is a particular scene that really stood with me. At this point in the story, the hero, John McClane, had already made some headway with the terrorists, and the conflict had been unfolding already. So the terrorists want to prove they mean business by showing what they're capable of. So they take control of the plane's air traffic control and adjust one of the plane's landing systems to have their trajectory set straight for the ground. Is that realistic? No, but I already explained one narrative concept, so don't make me explain suspension of disbelief as well. Anyways, John runs outside, trying to signal to the plane where to land, but it's snowy, so visibility is low. It's incredibly suspenseful, because you genuinely can't tell how John McClane is going to save them. And he doesn't. The plane crashes in a fiery explosion, and every single passenger dies. A precedent is established. Through fire, the film's stakes are shown to you, and it adds a whole bunch of tension to the rest of the movie when John fights more bad guys, because this situation is going to repeat. Not necessarily the whole crash thing, but there are other planes arriving to this airport, one of which has his wife on it. So when the situation repeats again and again, and the stakes rise more and more, we're much more unsure about if the day will be saved at all. When you boil it down, a story is a series of conflicts, leading to an overarching antagonist or antagonistic force. Almost like levels in a video game, leading to a final boss. So when we see John succeed at some of those lesser conflicts, yet fail at subsequent ones, that is when uncertainty takes root and tension is born. So if narrative tension is uncertainty about what will happen next, then the concept of gameplay tension should be simple. Uncertainty from the player about whether or not they will succeed. In a platform game, it should then be obvious. If there's a big gap, and players are uncertain about if Mario will make it, that's tension. Stakes are also a concept that comes naturally to platformers. Deaths are quantifiable and easily understood, but there's also some uncertainty about what happens when a game over occurs, and just what level elements can kill you. And just like with stories, there's some extra layers to how suspense is built up. Tension exists differently in Kirby's Epic Yarn, where you can't really die, than a brutal platformer like Super Meat Boy, and it's not as simple as, if a game's hard, it's got tension. Donkey Kong Country 2 is an example of tension being done excellently in a platformer, because it's pervasive in a lot of different ways. That's not just the difficulty, and every level has its own way of toying with the player. It feels absolutely intense. Most of it is simply just because Donkey Kong Country 2 is a difficult game, but it's not just in the gameplay. The visuals of the game have an effect on the psychology of the player as well. I'll talk about the gameplay aspect in a little bit, but yeah, let's talk about how this game looks first. Level design is an aspect that's critical to tension in a way you wouldn't expect. I don't mean level design as in how the level's challenges are designed, I mean in the same way you say the word character design, how it looks. Most platformers are a linear series of challenges that get harder and harder as you move on, and that's reflected in level themes as well, getting more and more intimidating. In Super Mario Bros. 3, you start at the Grassland and end at the Darkland, which is basically hell. And this escalation is meant to communicate to the player the descent into more difficult levels, so it generates tension as you move on. It's a great system, and it's something that's done in the original Donkey Kong Country. You start at the bright Congo Jungle, go to the Monkey Mines, Vine Valley, and Gorilla Glacier areas, and then the much darker Kremkrok Industries and the Chimp Caverns serve as the darker final areas before your clash with King K. Rool on his ship, the Gangplank Galleon. Donkey Kong Country 2 seems to escalate from its predecessor in a way that's rarely done, and there's almost an assumption you played the first game. You start out in Gangplank Galleon, which is now its own proper level, and move on to the Crocodile Isle, home of the Kremlings, which Diddy, over the course of a weekend or so, is about to commit genocide on. The normal conventions of cutesy/cool animal platformers are thoroughly subverted, because Donkey Kong Country 2's level themes are much more intense right off the bat. There's volcanoes, a flying fortress, enormous towers, and a dark, marshy bog with an air of death. When the most that Donkey Kong Country 1 could muster up was a dark cave. That's not to say Donkey Kong Country has bad level themes. If anything, it works in tandem with what the sequel gives us. Because after getting a more traditional platformer experience with the levels of the first game, the abruptness of the sequel can make players much more unsure about if they can succeed through the way the game looks. You're implicitly told this game means monkey business, and the standard is set for a much more tense experience. One of the single most controversial things you could possibly put into a video game is a limited save system. It's very rare to see it in modern games nowadays, because to restrict the amount you can save or the places a player can save feels like it takes away from the player a lot, and it can cause challenges that feel like they originate from meta elements of the game, rather than the game itself. However, sometimes it can be a deliberate thing in the game, and one of the most famous examples would be the first few Resident Evil games. Until Resident Evil 4 came along and reformed the save system, Resident Evil had a system where ink ribbons were a limited resource you take to typewriters, and if you're out of ink ribbons, no saves for you. It's a love it or hate it system, cause Resident Evil is a horror game, and this system, believe it or not, maximizes tension. It adds stakes that makes each death more punishing, and it makes players much more careful in the game. The issue is that when large sections of an area are repeated, it makes players know all of their little tricks, and they're better equipped to deal with it, trivializing sections of this horror game. Donkey Kong Country 2 has the save system. Every level has these secret coins, which can be exchanged for chances to play mini-games or something, but are mostly used to save. If you're out of coins, no saves for you. I'm not gonna say this is necessarily a good system, because it can be artificially frustrating when the fundamental act of saving is so limited for you, but when it does work, it works. There's much more of a sense of danger at certain points of the conquest, when your saving method is unstable in this way, and this uncertainty breeds tension. I think there's really some value in this system, and it encourages you to look around a little for those secrets as well. Say what you will about this game's save system, it's at least better than the original Donkey Kong Country. In the first game, save points are fairly limited, so you have to go through a bit of levels to get to one. But once you do get to that save point, the saving is unlimited, so you can just backtrack to it every time you beat a level. Why make the beginning of a world tense and then just drop it in the later two levels? Donkey Kong Country 2 lets you sort of set your own pace, but it does keep you on your toes by being limited with the coin supply. The level design exhibited in the Donkey Kong Country series is really an evolution of what Mario does. The Mario series is known for one basic tenet, which has defined not only its platforming design, but countless other games inspired by it for years to come. And that is to introduce a mechanic in a safe environment, let the player take their time to adjust to it, and then escalate that mechanic further and further to its possible limit. This is the single most effective way a platformer game can build tension. I want to give you an example from one of the most memorable levels in the early game of Donkey Kong Country 2, Red Hot Ride. Right when you start the level, you jump onto this balloon, and you learn how to press the D-pad forward to move the balloon, and jump off the balloon to get to safe ground. It's an easily understandable mechanic for a level gimmick. We're then introduced to the idea that you can use multiple jets to propel this balloon upwards, and a pattern emerges, where you get used to the idea of using the balloons to go over and under these zinger enemies. Just when you get comfortable, you slightly graze over a zinger, and there's a long stretch of lava, so you breathe a sigh of relief as you just barely manage to make it. The balloon is slow, but you have to be 100% certain of any move you make at this point. That long stretch repeats again, but this time you have to make a long jump because there's no air vent to save you this time. The level almost outsmarted you. This is all, of course, assuming you never died at least once in this entire section. You probably have at some point, and you might think this removes tension, but I disagree. If you just barely make it over a pit in a Mario game, and then you have to do it again, some tension will be alleviated when you've seen that you can do it, but do you honestly think that would remove tension for you? Especially because you know how difficult it is, and you know that you have a whole level to go through. You could honestly say it's analogous to rewatching a movie you like, cause yeah, there can still be tension in that scenario. Well anyways, after a checkpoint, this mechanic is stretched to its absolute limit. As bugs fly at you, the air jets get smaller, and right before this tension is relieved at the end, you'll need to jump from balloon to balloon and move the last balloon forward a little bit. An intense challenge, where the problems you need to face escalate and escalate, just like a movie, until you get to that final conflict and the level is beaten. Slowly but surely, the escalating difficulty of Donkey Kong Country 2 creeps up on you, and it's done masterfully. That is how platformers build tension. Tension is a topic that's analyzed a lot. You'll see all kinds of videos talking about it as a concept and how it affects our favorite stories to the very core. But in many ways, it's so much more than that, because it affects all sorts of aspects of how we enjoy media, especially video games. And it's not just platformers, too. Something like an action game, hack and slash, a fighting game, and of course a horror game, have way different ways of doing tension, so I just wish people would talk about it a little more. Because it's a huge part of this art form we all love, and it tackles the concept interestingly. Is that a word? Interestingly? Donkey Kong Country 2 does it in such a smart way, and it'll make you love the game even more. Don't let anyone tell you Donkey Kong isn't cool. And hey, analyzing the way games can be suspenseful adds to our enjoyment of the medium as a whole, and how it's different from something like a movie. Donkey Kong Country 2 is, and will always be, one of the greatest 2D platformers I've ever played. It's honestly near the peak of what the genre can achieve, and I think tension is a big part of it. I have done video essays on my channel before, but I haven't really done things as in-depth and as big as this one before. I guess this isn't that long, but you know what I mean. As important and as serious as this Donkey Kong video is. So I appreciate it if you enjoyed the video. If you did, feel free to subscribe and maybe watch another one. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you later.